Guido Marnef is professor of early modern history at the University of Antwerp. His research focuses on the Protestant and Catholic Reformations in the Low Countries, also the Dutch Revolt, and culture and education in early modern cities. He is a member of various editorial boards, president of 2 historical societies, and part of the advisory board for Refo 500, organized many, many years ago to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in 2017, and now it appears in perpetuity. He has been a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in The Hague, the Flemish Institute for Advanced Study in Brussels, and the Scaliger Institute of Leiden University. He's published numerous articles in journals and books about the Low Countries, maybe most notably his Antwerp in the Age of Reformation from 1550 to 77, but he's nearing completion of another big book on Antwerp during the short 8-year period when this famously Catholic city became a Calvinist republic. And that's the topic of his paper today. So we're glad to have Guido Marnef with us today.
Thank you, Greg, for your introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. And first of all, I would like to thank the Kennedy Center for giving me the opportunity to speak here in this lecture series about social justice. In my lecture, I will address 2 important questions crucial to the problem of social justice. Who got access to the political decision-making process, and what kind of social policy was elaborated by those who were in power? I will do this as an historian specialized in early modern history. But it goes without saying that the questions and problems I will tackle today are still very relevant for policymakers nowadays. The case I present today is about Antwerp, a city with a central place in 16th century Europe. And for those less familiar with 16th century European geography, I have some pictures. Try again. Yeah. You see here the Netherlands, also called the Low Countries. And then you see the map of the Low Countries with the several provinces, and Antwerp is here situated in the middle. And then we also have a very nice map of 16th century Antwerp, and you also see the new Italian-style city walls surrounding and protecting the city. From the late 15th century onwards, the city of Antwerp experienced an almost unparalleled demographic expansion. Thanks to the convergence of a number of international trade flows, Antwerp became the central mart of Europe and the hub of the capitalist world economy. With a population of around 100,000 inhabitants in 1566, and you see here a survey, Antwerp was, after Paris, the most populated European city north of the Alps. The city harbored a substantial group of foreign merchants, and at the same time, there was a massive inflow of immigrants attracted by the booming metropolis. Table 2 gives an idea of the occupational structure of Antwerp at the end of the 16th century. As a big metropolis, Antwerp welcomed merchants from all parts of Europe, and at the same time, the city was open to new ideas, including new religious ideas. In the early 1520s, the young Lutheran movement already had a strong foothold in Antwerp. In the 1530s, the Anabaptist movement arrived in Antwerp, and from the 1550s onwards, an underground Reformed or Calvinist church developed within the city walls. It was especially the central authorities in Brussels which tried to counter the spread of Protestantism, urging local town governments to adopt ever stricter heresy edicts. The militant and well-organized Calvinist Church did not hesitate to oppose the hostile authorities. During the so-called Wonder Year, or Annus Mirabilis, of 1566, the Calvinist leaders even became the backbone of the political resistance against the Spanish policy in the Netherlands. The next decades, Antwerp's fate was closely interwoven with the course of the Dutch Revolt, which lasted from 1568 until 1648. In 1567, the Duke of Alba arrived with a vast Spanish army. It was the start of years of submission and repression. With the citadel or Spanish castle integrated in the southern city walls, Alva henceforth controlled the city of Antwerp. And you can see here the citadel built by the Duke of Alba in a very quick time span. In November 1576, the mutiny of unpaid Spanish soldiers at the citadel caused a real disaster. They invaded the city and started 3 days of plunder and murder. At least 2,500 citizens were killed. At the beginning of August 1577, the Spanish garrison was expelled from the citadel and the Antwerp city fathers joined the revolt against Spain, headed by William of Orange. Antwerp even became the virtual capital of the Dutch Revolt. William of Orange established his court in Antwerp, and the rebellious government, central government institutions also came over to the city. And you see here a picture, a painting of William of Orange, painted in his Antwerp period, 1579. Antwerp's alliance with the Dutch Revolt brought the establishment of a new political regime, labeled as the Calvinist Republic. The Calvinists gradually seized power in the city government. At the same time, there were fundamental changes in the religious domain. In 1578 and 79, a religious peace was introduced in Antwerp, granting churches to the Calvinists and the Lutherans. The expansion of the Calvinist and Lutheran Church went at the expense of the Catholic community. Since the introduction of the first religious peace, the Catholics were forced to give up more and more churches and convents. In July 1581, the public exercise of the Catholic religion was even forbidden. From July 1584 until August 1585, the rebellious city was besieged by Alexander Farnese, the Spanish governor-general, and its anti-Spanish army. On the 17th of August 1585, the rebellious city fathers surrendered and accepted Farnese's capitulation treaty. The religious landscape was quite diverse during the Calvinist Republic. We have, and this is quite exceptional, quantitative data about the religious affiliation at the end of the Calvinist Republic. After the capitulation of the city in August 1585, the new city government wanted to purge the civic militia. Therefore, the city administration compiled a list of all civic militia members, some 10,000 at that moment, with the indication of their religious affiliation, reflecting the situation just before the fall of the city. There are unfortunately no data for women, and we can only guess to what extent they would change the male picture. It is in any case remarkable that the Catholics were still, and you see here the table with the results. Yeah, that's right. The Catholics were still the largest group, even after 5 years of Calvinist domination. Within the Protestant family, the Calvinists clearly outnumbered the Lutherans. The Anabaptists were a small, silent minority during the Calvinist Republic. Interesting and intriguing is the finding that the religious affiliation was unknown in 12% of the cases. The period of the Calvinist Republic constitutes a unique experiment in the history of Antwerp, and the changes and developments during this complex episode allow us to tackle the two main questions of my lecture: the question about political representation and decision-making, and the question about social justice. Before turning to the Calvinist Republic and the problem of political decision-making, it is perhaps useful to look to the broader picture and to explain how early modern cities were governed. In most European cities, the city council, also called the small council, was the engine of the political decision-making process. The size of these councils could be very different, going from a dozen to 100 or even more members. In some cases, election or appointment could be for life, but in most cities there was a process of periodic renewal. In many cities, election was organized by a system of internal co-option. In other places, the overlord appointed the city council members, usually choosing them from a list submitted by the sitting council. Many city councils were dominated by a small group of noble or semi-noble families, often interconnected by marriage. In other cities, representatives of the craft guilds had a guaranteed number of seats in the council. Yet historians usually agree that most councils were dominated by a small group of elite families. Furthermore, they also assume that the power of the city councils diminished over time, confronted as they were with the powerful and even absolutist overlords. In spite of this trend, there was still room for broader political representation within cities. In a recent book, Maarten Prak, and you see here, the book is just published a few months ago. Maarten Prak emphasizes that forms of citizen participation in the political and administrative processes of medieval and early modern towns were much more common than is usually acknowledged. He refers to the existence of common or broad councils, a kind of general assemblies advising the town or city council, to the inclusion or the consultation of citizen representatives, often guildsdeans, in core institutions of urban government, and to direct or indirect elections for municipal offices. Finally, Maarten Prak added another element that contributed to a broader representation of the citizenry in a number of early modern cities: the civic militias. Due to the so-called military revolution, the role of standing armies in the service of mighty kings and emperors increased, while the impact of temporary citizen soldiers diminished. Yet, Professor Prak argues that the civic militias remained significant as political forces. They served as platforms for the articulation of political claims and as vehicles for citizen agency in general. These civic militias are perhaps best known for the paintings still existing of the civic militia, particularly in the Dutch Republic. And you see here a painting made by Frans Hals, who was, by the way, born in Antwerp during the Calvinist Republic. After this European picture, it is time to turn to 16th century Antwerp. The political and institutional framework of 16th century Antwerp corresponds in many respects to the general European situation. In Antwerp, too, there was a city council. This city council, or Stadsmagistraat in Dutch, was by far the most important administrative body responsible for the day-to-day running of the city in all its aspects. The council consisted of 2 burgomasters, 16 or 18 aldermen, 2 treasurers, and a receiver. The treasurers and the receiver were responsible for the financial policy of the city. When we look at the social composition of the city council, then we see that a limited number of elite families with a noble or semi-noble stature had a completely dominant position. Often, members of these families were connected to each other through marriage. As a commercial metropolis, 16th century Antwerp seems to deviate from the general pattern. In several commercial cities, such as Lyon, Sevilla, and London, a small group of rich merchants had pushed aside the traditional elite families and had taken control over the urban policies. In Antwerp, on the contrary, only a few burgomasters and aldermen were involved in trade. Why the merchant dominance did not materialize in 16th century Antwerp is not completely clear. An explanation might be that the Antwerp merchants did not feel the need to take over power because they could influence the urban decision-making process from the sideline in an informal way. The city council was not the only political body in Antwerp. Just as in many other early modern cities, there was also a common or broad council. The Antwerp Broad Council consisted of 4 branches which were considered to represent the different social layers of urban society. The City Council formed the first member, the old or former alderman the second, the 4 headmen and 26 wardmasters the third, and the deans of the 26 privileged craft guilds the fourth member. The headmen and the wardmasters represented the well-to-do citizenry, mainly merchants. The Broad Council met only occasionally, especially when the central government asked for new taxes, which had to be approved and raised by the city government. In practice, years could pass between meetings of the Broad Council. In the 16th century, the cities were more and more confronted with a strong central monarchy, backed by a growing bureaucracy and a standing army. In the Low Countries, Charles V and his successor Philip II tried to impose their power, but the mighty Antwerp metropolis did everything in order to defend its privileges and autonomy. The new town hall, built in the first half of the 1560s, was an expression of Antwerp's political power. And you see here a contemporary engraving of the new city hall, and that's present-day picture. After the political troubles of the Wonder Year, it was the Duke of Alba who stopped Antwerp's autonomy and put the Antwerp city fathers under strict supervision. As I already mentioned, the Spanish fury of 1576 once again demonstrated how the city of Antwerp was in the grip of the Spanish king and his army. Yet this difficult situation suddenly changed in August 1577, when the citadel was liberated from its Spanish garrison. The Antwerp city fathers now joined the rebellious movement of William of Orange, and the city soon became the capital of the Dutch Revolt, and after some years also a stronghold of the Calvinist Church. This shift went hand in hand with the fundamental change of the institutional framework and the system of political representation. Henceforth, much more citizens were involved in the political decision-making process. Let us start with the institutional heart of the city administration, the City Council. In December 1577, the City Council was renewed. New burgomasters and aldermen were chosen under the guidance of William of Orange. Most city fathers were, at that moment, still Catholic, but there was a change in their social profile. Many representatives of the traditional patrician elite families had been removed, and several newcomers made their entrance in the City Council. When we bring together the information about all the city councils appointed during the Calvinist Republic, then we see this trend confirmed. All the elite families, except one, disappeared from the City Council. The gap with the past is also clear in another way. In several cases, the place of the elite families was filled by merchants. Obviously, they felt the need to defend their commercial interests in these dangerous and insecure times. From late 1579 onwards, convinced Calvinists completely dominated the City Council. Several of them returned from the refugee centers in Germany, where they had found a safe haven in the 1560s and 1570s. From a social perspective, the city fathers active in the City Council represented broader segments of society than their predecessors did. Yet, a larger social representation was primarily realized in the Broad Council. Here, representatives of the well-to-do citizens and the craft guilds had a guaranteed place. This was, of course, already the case in the pre-1577 period. But during the Calvinist Republic, the Broad Council's impact increased significantly. First of all, the Broad Council did not meet sporadically, but developed into a nearly permanent assembly. Furthermore, the competence of the council was not restricted to financial or fiscal matters, as was the case in the past, but had to handle a huge variety of topics, including many political and religious issues in the context of the Dutch Revolt. The decision-making process of the Broad Council was slow, if not to say very slow. The council decided, in fact, by consensus, but this consensus was often difficult to reach. In practice, the City Council, and I have a scheme to make this clear, the City Council introduced or proposed as first member the topics or problems to be discussed. Then, the three other met separately and started their discussions. Especially among the deans of the 26 craft guilds, the consultation and decision-making process could be very time-consuming. The deans of the 26 guilds were in fact divided into 3 sub-branches or chambers, which met and deliberated separately. Once the 3 chambers were on the same line, the City Council had a difficult job to reconcile the opinions of the 4 members of the Broad Council and to push for a consensus. This decision-making process was based on the input of representative layers of urban society. As a consequence, it was undoubtedly more democratic and more just if we compare with what existed before. But there were also serious disadvantages. Especially in a period of war, quick decisions could be of crucial importance. William of Orange more than once appeared in the Broad Council complaining about the never-ending discussions and urging for fast and vigorous decisions. What Francesco Guicciardini said in 1520 in his work dialogue of the political regiment of Florence also applies to the situation in Antwerp. I quote, "Government of the many is lacking in quite a number of important things: secrecy, speed, and what is worse, resolution." Another element that gave more weight to the Antwerp citizenry as a representative voice in the political decision-making process was the civic militia. At this point, the Antwerp situation corresponds remarkably well to the observations made by Professor Maarten Prak about the political impact of civic militias in the early modern period. One of the first decisions the Antwerp city fathers took after the expulsion of the Spanish garrison was to mobilize a permanent civic militia. A city ordinance of the 12th of December 1577 regulated all aspects of the civic militia's organization and functioning. The civic militia consisted of 80 companies of 200 citizens each. In principle, all male citizens between 20 and 60 qualified for incorporation, and most of them were in fact incorporated. An 81st company consisting of 200 young men was added as a separate unit. The civic militia counted, in other words, more than 16,000 men. In this way, the Antwerp citizens and inhabitants could exercise a significant military power. The civic militia was organized on a geographical basis. The 80 companies were in fact recruited in and distributed over the 13 Antwerp wards. Each company was headed by a captain who commanded a number of minor officers. Next to the civic militia existed 6 shooting companies, comprising 100 men each. Each of the 6 companies was headed by 2 deans. In general, the shooting companies were considered as a kind of civic elite troops. Members of the shooting companies were all Antwerp citizens and free of service in the civic militia. In the period of the Dutch Revolt, the captains of the civic militia and the deans of the shooting companies were often consulted when city governments had to take important decisions, and this happened also during the Calvinist Republic. In a certain way, the captains and deans were treated as they were a member of the Broad Council, the 5th member, so to say. When we put all these representative bodies together, the City Council, the Broad Council, the captains of the civic militia, and the deans of the shooting companies, then we can conclude that the political decision-making process had a broad underpinning in urban society. It is perhaps a little bit dangerous from a methodological point of view to calculate a representation rate by comparing the number of all those with a representative function with the overall population figure. We can even make a further step and do the same exercise for present-day Antwerp. And you see the result of this exercise here. I don't go into the details, but if we compare the ratio for the Calvinist Republic, one representative for 422 inhabitants, and when we compare that with the situation for present-day Antwerp, then we see that the representation ratio was 4 times higher in the 16th century. There is, however, one element that we have to take into account. During the Calvinist Republic, Antwerp became more and more a divided city. During the first years of the Republic, most Catholics joined the new regime and the rebellious movement. Catholics too had indeed suffered from the Spanish policy. the terrible effects of the Spanish Fury of 1576 were still in everyone's mind, of Catholics and Protestants alike. Yet soon after the first years, there was a forceful politico-religious polarization process, closely connected to the course of the Dutch Revolt. In the city council, the broad council, and in the companies of the civic militia, Catholics and Protestants started to see each other as opponents. In the craft guilds, there were in 1580-81 heavy discussions and even power struggles between Catholics and Protestants, especially at the occasion of the annual election of the deans. Similar struggles took place in other civic corpora. In most cases, the Protestants, and especially the Calvinists, won because they could rely on the military power in and around the city. As a consequence, we may assume that the representative bodies active during the Calvinist Republic more and more represented the Protestant part of the urban population. Yet, the gradual process of Calvinist takeover does not exclude that the representative administrative bodies took decisions which were favorable for both Protestants and Catholics, especially in the social domain. This brings me to the second part of my lecture. This second part brings us in the heart of the lecture series organized by the Kennedy Center, the problem of social justice. Now that the social and fiscal policy was not anymore the preserve of a small and self-interested elite, one can wonder whether the new political regime with its larger social basis conducted a different, a more just social and fiscal policy. I'll focus on the fiscal policy of the new regime, not only because this is a very well-documented case, but also because the fiscal policy is an excellent indicator for the overall social policy. Furthermore, the fiscal policy concerned and touched all inhabitants within the Antwerp city walls. The domain of fiscal policy and fiscal practice is a very complex and technical one. But there are some general features and trends we have to keep in mind. First of all, in the late medieval and 16th century cities of the Low Countries and in Europe in general, indirect taxes were completely dominant. These indirect taxes were retail and consumption taxes, levied on foods and beverages like grain and beer. These essential products were consumed by rich, middle class, and poor people alike. But poor people had, of course, to spend a much larger part of their income on primary consumption. As a consequence, taxes on beer and grain hit the rank and file people much more than the rich. Furthermore, some privileged categories in urban societies, such as the clergy, were free from these indirect taxes. In most cities, indirect taxes on retail and consumption produced at least 80% and in some cases 90% and more of the total urban income. In Antwerp, indirect taxes, primarily on beer, were in the mid-16th century good for 81% of the total income. The result of this system was that public taxes contributed to the reproduction of social inequality. The growing fiscal demands of the central state even strengthened this inequality, especially when the wages of day laborers did not follow the increasing prices. The taxes emanating from local and central authorities could be a very heavy burden. From the very beginning of the Calvinist Republic, it was clear that the Antwerp citizens did not only want a political, but also a social change. When we look at the decisions taken by the new City Council and the Broad Council, which henceforth met on a nearly daily basis, then we see that they realized indeed a new fiscal policy. I just refer to a few decisions and measures which illustrate the new approach. In May 1578, the city government proclaimed a luxury tax on the wearing of silk clothes. The underlying idea was that excessive luxury deserved extra taxation, and that everyone had to pay according to wealth and status. The introduction to the ordinance proclaiming the new tax clearly contained a social vision with even an anti-Spanish flavor. I quote, "Knowing that the pomposity planted by the Spaniards in these lands is so excessive and so rooted in the people through their abundances and costly attire of silk, so that it is nearly impossible to distinguish the mistress from the servant, the noble woman and noble man from the burgher and the tradeswoman, exceeding among them in pride and bombastic behavior." End quote. The ordinance contained a long list of categories of clerical and lay persons, each with what they had to pay, ranging from 100 guilders for a bishop to 3 guilders for a servant or his widow. Such lists distinguishing different status groups also existed in the German Empire, where sumptuary legislation was quite common in the 16th century. In Antwerp, the May 1578 ordinance is, as far as I can see, the first example. A second example or argument. From the beginning, there was a deliberate aim to limit fiscal exemptions as much as possible. It was especially the clergy, male and female, which was targeted with this policy. Even the religious peace of 1579 stipulated in Article 5 that the clergy was subject to the city government and that they had to contribute in indirect taxes, 10 and 100 pennies, these were direct taxes, and all other civil duties without enjoying any fiscal liberty. The fiscal exemptions of the clergy were an old problem in urban society. Already in the late medieval period, lay people complained that they had to pay taxes on the beer they consumed, while the clergy, especially the better-off parish clergy and the rich male convents, were not taxed for their large quantities of quality beers and wines. A third example is the technique of forced loans. These forced loans were attractive when the city government had to raise money in a quick time span. In theory, the city government promised to pay back all those who had to contribute in the loan. In practice, this promise was often not realized because the city administration was constantly in lack of money. In October 1579, the Broad Council consented a forced loan of 52,000 guilders to be paid during 3 consecutive months. The extra money was necessary for the payment of rebellious troops around Antwerp. The forced loan was divided over 300 persons, I quote, being the most principal and the most famous citizens and merchants residing in the city. The 300 persons were divided in 5 wealth categories, that's what you see here, each with a specific amount they had to contribute each month. The first and richest category counted 15 persons, paying together 15,000 guilders each month. In other words, the 5% richest persons paid 29%. In category 5, so at the bottom, we see the opposite. 100 persons, or just 1/3 of the total, had to pay 5,000 guilders, or 9.6%. The fiscal principle was clear. The strongest shoulders had to bear the heaviest burden. The 15 richest contributors were all merchants or merchant companies, and in the other 4 categories, the merchant class was still completely dominant. The collection of the forced loan caused fierce resistance and led to animated discussions in the Broad Council. It was especially the deans of the craft guilds who pleaded for the maintenance and collection of the forced loan. They argued that the merchants involved were rich and wealthy enough to pay their share in the loan. In February 1580, the collection was resumed. If necessary, the captains and their civic militia men were mobilized to force unwilling contributors. The operation was successful. With a collected amount of 149,000 guilders, the forced loan was nearly completely realized. 149,000 guilders was a substantial amount of money if we realize that in 1580, indirect taxes on beer totaled 282,000 guilders, and those on wine 82,000 guilders. Strictly spoken, the forced loan was not a direct tax, since the loan qualified for repayment. To what extent the contributing merchants were actually reimbursed is not clear. Yet, my main argument is that the strategy of a forced loan followed the principle of contributing according to wealth. The new city regime tried to realize the same principle with a series of direct taxes, levied since late 1577. These direct taxes of different nature and techniques were mainly based on the value of immovable property. Especially during the period of the siege of Antwerp, from July 1584 until August 1585, there was an increasing series of direct taxes on property. Not all the direct tax accounts have been conserved, but based on the registers we still have, we can conclude that the direct taxes raised more than 900,000 guilders, which is even for a city as Antwerp an enormous amount of money. These direct taxes were, of course, more just than the indirect taxes, since the wealthy owners paid the bulk. Furthermore, a substantial part of the urban population was exempt because they were considered too poor to contribute. We know, for instance, that 4,600 persons contributed to the direct taxes levied from November 1584 until April 1585, which means that around 75% of the householders was exempt. All this evidence makes clear that the regime of the Calvinist Republic realized a fundamental change in the fiscal policy. The strong focus on indirect taxes on retail and consumption was left, and a variety of direct taxes was launched. Here, the principle was that taxes were paid according to status and wealth. Another element, underscoring once again the new policy, is that the indirect taxes levied on daily consumption products were reshuffled. Taxes on common, cheaper beers diminished, and taxes on the better beers and on wine rose. There is no doubt that there is a strong link between the new tax policy and the larger representativeness of the city government. It was especially the deans of the craft guilds who pushed in the broader council for a more just tax system. The new tax policy did, however, not impede that the citizens of Antwerp had still to pay a lot of taxes, probably more than they had done before, although the efforts were better divided over urban society. One of the main features of the early modern tax system is indeed that taxes were levied in function of the anticipated expenses. and the circumstances of war caused a constant demand for money. Yet there are indications that there was in general a willingness to contribute. This willingness can undoubtedly be linked to what specialists of present-day tax systems call tax compliance. They argue that in societies with a transparent political and economic organization, tax morale will be high. I think we see something similar in Antwerp during the Calvinist Republic. New taxes were only proclaimed after they had been discussed and consented in the Broad Council. The deans of the guilds more than once stated in the Broad Council that they were prepared to consent the taxes proposed, I quote, if they were consented and levied in a general way. With a general way, they meant with the consent of the different bodies or members of the Broad Council. Through this representative negotiation process, the new taxes gained much more legitimacy in urban society. For the actual organization and collection of the taxes, the Antwerp city government could rely upon a sophisticated citizens' network, the captains and their civic militias. Also at this level, active involvement of citizens was helpful. The contrast with the situation in the late 1560s and the early 1570s is in any case striking. At that moment, the Duke of Alba launched this new tax system, also based on real wealth and property. Historians agree that Alba's tax system was modern and more just compared to what existed before. But the new tax system met heavy resistance because it was imposed and associated with a regime of repression and terror. There is perhaps still another element that was favorable for the new taxes. Until 1583, the evolution of the living standard was positive. Wages were relatively high and prices were under control. Here too, the new regime conducted a social policy. Prices of basic consumption products were topped at a certain level so that they remained in reach of the common people. I think we can now conclude that the Calvinist Republic was a successful experiment in social justice. The new political regime and the new institutional framework, with an openness for different layers of urban society, conducted a different and more just social policy. We may not forget, of course, that the Calvinists who gradually seized power were a minority, but it is undeniable that their social policy was also favorable to rank-and-file Catholics. It is, however, difficult to pinpoint how they, the Catholics, taxed a favorable social policy and an oppressive religious policy, especially in the later years of the Calvinist Republic. But that the social policy of the new Calvinist regime generated sympathy among Protestants and Catholics is undeniable. The new approach of the Calvinist regime is the more obvious when we compare with what happened immediately after the capitulation of the city in August 1585. With the new Catholic regime returned the dominance of the small group of elite families. They immediately raised the indirect taxes on beer, also on the cheaper beers, and on grain, and left the system of direct taxes. I do hope, ladies and gentlemen, that this micro case about 16th century Antwerp taught you something about the mechanisms of social justice in the past, but also in the present. I thank you for your attention.
We know that many of you will have to leave to go to class. We have 5 or 10 minutes if any of you have some questions to ask. Please again, come up. The microphone here.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm a geography major here at BYU. My question is, do you believe, I guess, this forced loan, has this forced loan ever been tried on a larger scale in a larger country outside of just the city, or is that something that's never really been tried, I guess, on a progressively larger scale?
Yeah, well, this was indeed used on a larger scale. It was also used in the Dutch Republic, for instance. So it was not a very common technique, but it also existed in other countries. And it was, of course, a progressive taxation system. Huh?
And in the Dutch Republic with the forced loans, were those ever repaid?
Well, there's a new book about public finance in the Dutch Republic, published by Wanty Fritschie, and I can check that. At least there were attempts to repay, and that certainly happened in the Dutch Republic. But whether they received a full reimbursement, that's something I don't dare to say.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.